Well, no joke today, because this one's serious. There'll still be beer, though. Cheers. Welcome back to me making a serious video. It's about a topic that a lot of us have talked about before in different situations, and then it's also about a topic that way too few people on booktube have talked about, and I'll talk about that as well. So let's talk about separating the art from the artist, especially when those artists are somewhat problematic, to put it mildly. And then let's talk about how all of that applies to Neil Gaiman. Now, I have seen a few videos on booktube, very few, which I think is partly a bit of an issue. I've seen some other videos on the subject. I'll link some important stuff down below later. The structure will be, as I said, this. I'll talk about separating the art from the artist. I'll try to give a few ideas, pointers, and so forth, both for us as just consumers of media, readers, music listeners, so forth, whatever. And then I'll talk about how having a platform of any kind, of any sort, as a creator, in particular, in this case, obviously, as a booktuber, may change the situation compared to those of, just a consumer. And after all of that, I'll talk about the Neil Gaiman situation, and I will, of course, try to apply what I've said before on that specific situation. And then I'll just leave it up to you to discuss the whole thing. And just to make it very clear, I don't want anyone defending Neil Gaiman down there. That's not the point. This is not the platform for that. I will try not to talk about the details of the case here. I want to talk about what we do in such situations, not, litigate the whole case. This is not the place for this. All right, that being said, let's get started and talk about separating art and artist. All right, you can't separate the art from the artist, ever, fully. Now, don't get mad at me, I'll try to explain what I mean, but let's just accept that fully separating art and artist is impossible. You may tell yourself that you can do that, but you can't. You will never be able to do that. Unless you do get a text and you don't know who it's by, you have no names, you have nothing but just the text. Because all the other stuff that is around a text, and text in this case also being music, where it's even harder, all of these forms of art come in a context, and that context will already influence you in some way, shape, or form. And that is the same case with artists. Do you know, you read a name, that name will give you stuff that you will infer. If it's a name that sounds, that gives you a specific language association. If it's a name that gives you a specific gender association, you grew up in a context that will give you certain framings for, how you read the text. So even in, except the one point where you get a very neutrally formatted text with no additional information whatsoever, in any other ways, in any other situation, you will not be able to separate the art from the artist. So let's just stop that discussion here. Now let's move forward. Yes, there are different ways of dealing with that, and we'll talk about those situations in several steps. And I'll explain why I think sometimes it's easier to separate art and artists, sometimes it's less easy, sometimes there are even other considerations that are in there. So let's start with the first differentiation that I want to make. There is art by old artists, old art, that is, anything, let's just say by dead guys, although I don't mean just by dead guys. Stuff that has been published before you find out anything more about the artist beyond, just name and whatnot. That's what we call old art. And then there's new art. Now that you have found out that whoever is creating that art is a dickhead, what do you do now? Those are two different cases. We'll start with the first one, and then we move forward to the second one. And we'll do so first as, consumers, and then we'll talk about what it means as creators, because there are slight differences. All right, old art. There's a difference between old artists and old art. Let's start with old artists and old art. Case in point, H.P. Lovecraft. We know he's a racist. We probably didn't know when we first read his stories, unless we were already aware of, how racism looks, because then you can recognize it in his texts. But let's just assume we were not aware of that because we were 12 and we read, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and we found it a really cool horror story. And then later on we find out all the other rest. Now, obviously, separating art and artist can be easy in those situations up to a point. And that's sort of fine. Because on the one hand, whatever we do, H.P. Lovecraft is not profiteering from, benefiting from our reading or not reading his stories. The only reason here not to read the stories is basically, well, you don't want to, read something that makes you uncomfortable, which is absolutely acceptable, fine. Don't read anything if it, annoys you, triggers you, or any other way, shape, or form. That is totally fine. So that's the first case. Now let's talk about old art by artists that are still alive. Say you are a kid and you read Ender's Game. You love that book. You think it's the best science fiction book ever. Years later, you find out that Orson Scott Card, not to put a finer point on it, is a bit of a dickhead. To put it more, he's a homophobic asshole. We can be frank around here. Here's where things get problematic, because if you read this book as a teenager, it has formed part of your personality. It had an impact back then on you, and that impact is still part of who you are. So what will happen? It'll come with a lot of, feelings of guilt. You realize you've read something by a bad person, you weren't aware of it at the time, and so forth. That is something that we all have to deal with. Now, let's talk about me. I listen to a lot of heavy metal. You know that. A lot of heavy metal is made by a lot of very, very problematic people. I found out about lots of these problems during, say, the pandemic, because a lot of people, especially in the US, turned out to be very conservative, very anti-vax, very pro-Trump, and all the other darker stuff that goes down that rabbit hole when you start drifting down that direction. That was not very nice to find out. One specific case being, of course, John Schaffer, songwriter, main guy of the band Iced Earth, who was played the second large concert I ever attended. That had a huge impact on me as a person. I still own a shit ton of their records because of that. It's probably one of the major reasons, because that show was brilliant, was one of the major reasons I stuck with heavy metal, and I'm still into that kind of stuff. Yeah, that guy went to the Capitol on January 6th, 2020. He went into the Capitol, and he actually went to prison for that. How do you think that makes me feel whenever I go back and try to listen to one of these records? But I can't deny that they still touch me on an emotional level. So stuff is already much more difficult here for me as a consumer of these things. I don't feel guilty for having given that man money back in the day as a teenager when I first listened to their music, before I, learned that he turned more and more into a bit of a hardcore right-wing person, which obviously happened long before 2020 in this case, but I stopped giving him money, before that. But it still kind of makes me feel shitty to know that I'm listening to stuff that has an emotional impact on me, even now when I read, watch these, well, not watch, but listen to these music, and there's positive emotions connected to these things, and there's negative emotions, both sort of vibe within my soul at that moment. I don't feel guilty for having given him money, because at the time he wasn't that problematic, which is obviously the next part that is important here. Are we talking about supporting an author monetarily, or are we talking about stuff that we own, and the author of the artist has not profited from that after the point that we knew they were bad people? So that's the next version, right? Artist is still alive, the art is old or predates, or us encountering the art predates our moment of finding out that these people were dickheads. That's the second version. I think that's something we need to figure out with ourselves. Are we still able to listen to this? Are we going full denial? That's something we need to, deal with ourselves. Now let's talk about new art. So you know that H.P. Lovecraft was a massive misogynist, a massive anti-Semite, a massive racist. You have heard all about that. You've maybe read articles about it. You know all about it. Do you now go out and read more of his art, acquire more of his art, buy more of his books to read them? Well, there's a lot of ways to go about this. On the one hand, in this specific case, you can go and go like, well, I'm going to read these books and see how Lovecraft's racism informs the way he creates horror, how those things interact. I can do a lot of analysis about that kind of stuff. I can still go and read these books and go like, well, I can sort of ignore it because there's other stuff in there that I really like, and I can go, well, it's, 100 years old, almost like 90 years old, I can get away with it. This is something that you have to deal with it's between you and your elder gods, basically. I can't tell you what to do in that regard. Lovecraft is dead, he's not profiting from that. He's not profiting from that. Other in that category are nowadays, obviously, people like Marion Zimmer Bradley, and once again, these are all very individual cases, and all of these cases are individual, so there will be stuff that we need to talk about in a moment as well that I think is important there. What about, however, new art from living artists? This, I think, is the key case that we need to talk about the most. Because all the other cases, I'm like, you got to figure out how you deal with this on a personal level. New art by new artists. Say, there's a new book by Orson Scott Card. Are you willing to give this guy money? Even though you know what he will do with that money, what kind of person he is, and so forth. Now, I would say no. There are obviously other ways for you. If you feel you really need to still support this artist by, or still need to read all his books because he's just such an important influence on you and so forth. You can go and, find ways to do that without giving that person any more money. Once again, this is sort of between you and your elder gods in that regard because, But, figure out whether you are willing to willingly give money to a person that is, according to your lights and mine, in this case, a bad person. Because you're supporting someone evil. Let's just, be clear. You're supporting a bad person with money. I wouldn't do that. Obviously, I'm not the czar of the world, not even the czar of booktube. I can't tell you what to do, but I personally would not do that. So these are basically the problem with problematic authors, the way I see it, as a consumer. Now let's talk about being creators of some sort. And here's where stuff gets kind of trickier, I think. Because on the one hand, once again, in case one, old art by old artists, yeah, we can talk about these. If, we feel they are relevant to us as a person, to our argument that we want to make, to the genre that we talk about, you can't get away with, talking about horror and fantasy and science fiction in a larger context and never mentioning Lovecraft. That's just really, really difficult, and your content will actually suffer for that. You can still do that, but, there are situations where you need to make sure that, you get your shit together. Will you still talk about old art by still living artists? Now, here stuff gets more tricky because whether we want to say this or not, want to accept this or not, whenever we talk about a piece of art on the internet, there will be people who hear us talk about this and they'll go, well, I guess I want to find out more about this. I'll go and check it out. So we are potentially making money for these people. So if I go and tell you all about how wonderful Ender's Game is, some of you out there might go and give money to Orson Scott Card. There are ways not to do this, right? We can talk about a book by Orson Scott Card, an old one, and go like, well, it's a really good book. It has had a huge impact on fantasy, on science fiction in this case more, and so forth. But be aware, this guy is a massive homophobe. If you give him money, he'll probably donate it to incredibly terrible things that, align with his very specific worldview. He'll probably fund all kinds of anti-gay organizations with your money. And then we can add some information down below and go like, this is this. This I would call responsibility, because once we know these things and we are telling other people about it, there is, up to a point, a duty to inform people about what's going on there. They can still go like, well, I'll go and give him money anyway. That's beyond you. You can't force anyone else to do this either. But you have done your good faith, your best faith effort to tell people, to inform people about what has happened there. I think this is the important part. We're talking about important old art by still living terrible people. Now, what about new art by dead people? Well, I would say talk about it if you think, it's important. Not that there is new art by dead people, usually. But, the same thing applies. Just talk about it. Mention the context. I think it's important here so people are aware of it. And that's that. What about new art by still living terrible people? If a new, once again, Orson Scott Card, I'm picking on him right now because we'll talk about Neil Gaiman in particular in a moment, and I figured we'll talk about someone else here for a moment. Say a new Orson Scott Card book comes out. Do you talk about this? Well, I can't stop you from doing it, but the question is a new Orson Scott Card book such a big deal for the, larger sphere that we are working in, that we are talking about here, that it is basically unavoidable for you to talk about this, to actually give active promotion to a new work by this person? Now, I would argue that is usually not the case. There are probably a few people where we can go like, well, if we find out that Stephen King is an incredibly terrible person, and I don't know anything about Stephen King, I'm just taking him out as one of the biggest names in genre fiction at the moment. If we find out about something terrible that he did, talking about a new Stephen King book might still be sort of thought as almost relevant because, at least from a certain size, we do have sort of a duty to inform the public. Not duty, but But beyond that, I feel like talking about new works by these people is something we should probably refrain from. But if we feel we actually have to, we still need to give that context, right? So I think that's the next case here. A good example here would be China Miéville's Book of Elsewhere, where I did in fact just, mention that there is, accusations against Miéville and linked stuff down there. I just thought and a book by China Miéville, especially if it's, that collaboration with Keanu Reeves, might be actually important enough if we're talking about genre fiction to mention. So these are the main things. Now let's move on to Neil Gaiman. And before we actually go deeply into the Neil Gaiman thing, one final thing. We need to talk about what all the things that can be called problematic. Because there are different ones. The question is usually, if someone is problematic, are we talking about a generic thing? Are we talking about a massive racist? Are we talking about a massive homophobe? Are we talking about someone who has done something specifically evil where there are concrete personal, victims? Say Marion Zimmer Bradley having abused and helped her husband abuse her daughter. Now that is, of course, we know who's the victim in this case. There's a difference there because whatever we do, those victims, if they are still around, might actually see us supporting, their abusers. And that is different from having someone who's just generically just hating one entire marginalized group. I think we need to be aware of that difference. Also, if they have done something like that or something similar, what signal does that send to other people that are in a similar situation? That is the next part that we need to be aware of. Now that we have all seen all of these things, let's talk about Neil Gaiman in detail and then wrap this thing up. All right, Neil Gaiman, you all know him, author of books, graphic novels, screenwriter, all of these things, writer of way too many forewords, quotes, and so forth on books, but a big guy within the genre fiction sphere, in general fandom at this point with the TV shows for Sandman and Good Omens, all of that stuff. Very beloved for a long time, sort of a vocal supporter for marginalized groups and so forth. But within the last couple of weeks, multiple women have come forward with very clear accusations of at least abuse of power, probably disregarding consent, and so forth. Which, I'm not going to go into all the details. I'll link some videos down below if you want to go through the, clear accusations. It's not my goal to litigate this right now here. But he certainly is a problematic person right now. From where I'm standing, he's a massive dickhead. I have, of course, read books by Neil Gaiman before. I'm a huge Terry Pratchett fan. Of course, I've read Good Omens. I've read some other of his books. I enjoyed some more than others, but I'm in there. So I have some stakes in this matter. As a consumer, I will of course reread Good Omens because it's a good book. Probably my enjoyment will be less than it was before, but yeah, that's between me and my elder gods. But how do we now litigate this as consumers? All the stuff that we have, I mean, once again, that's between us and ourselves. Like, can we still enjoy this enough that it's worth rereading his books or not? I can't tell you what to do there. Will I go and buy new Neil Gaiman books? Oh, I will not. I personally will not do that because I don't want to support the man. Can I tell you not to do that? Of course not. If you do this as a consumer, that's, between you and yourself. The question is, if you are someone who does that, will you then go and tell other people about it? Even if you're not a consumer, even if you're not a creator. I would be careful about that. I'm not doing it in this case, but the question is, who are you telling this to? And what message does this send? Because what we're talking about here is abuse, possibly sexual abuse. And there's a lot of victims of that out there. You probably know someone who has been at least harassed in their lifetime. And if you tell those kind of people, well, I'm supporting someone who is very publicly accused by multiple women of doing this kind of thing, think about what message that sends to your potential friends. So once again, even if you're doing it, I would probably not tell anyone about it. Do the thing on your own, and that's that. Now we come to being creators. How do we deal with this? Now, the way I would go about this is like, look at, have I already done content on Neil Gaiman? No, I personally have not done so. I've not made any videos on it. Thank the gods. If I had made videos on it, I would put together a disclaimer on, the Neil Gaiman situation with some links for information, go back to my old videos and put it up top, either as a pinned comment or in the video description. So people who watch this, come across this content right now, have the full picture. I think that is a certain form of intellectual honesty. I would do that. That's the next part. Why would I do this? Now, I've seen people argue that they will still go and support, Neil Gaiman and so forth, because nothing of this has been handled in court. I think that's a bullshit argument, because we're talking about one specific situation here. We're talking about abuse, and we're talking about abuse with very specific individual victims. And those of you who have had experiences by, either having anything to do with anyone who has ever experienced abuse, you are aware of the fact that very few of these cases end up in court. So going, well, I guess he's presumed innocent does not necessarily work because, we're talking about one specific form of, in this case, abuse that is almost never ends up in court, even though the acts have happened. So I think that's a bit of a cop-out that I personally would not go with. Now, should you call him, anything? Maybe don't if you are afraid of legal repercussions or anything. But you can always go like, well, there are accusations. Here they are. This is links from journalists or whatever that I trust. Now you can inform yourself. I think that's the least we can do. Even though these are ongoing cases. Now, once again, this is the point here. Like, there are multiple people who have accused him. They are all alive. Chances of them, watching my videos are basically non-existent. But if you're a larger content creator, they may come across these kind of things. So are you willing to send the message of like, hey, I don't care what happened there. I'm still going to talk about this stuff to those victims. And that's something that can potentially happen. Are you willing to send this message to anyone else who has suffered through any form of abuse of power, abuse of, within or without a relationship, anything of the sort? Are you willing to send the kind of message that goes like, well, I don't care because I like this stuff. I'm willing to talk about it. I'm willing to give an abuser, a potential, an accused abuser, let's phrase it this way, I'm willing to give that person free promotion in the future, talk about how great his art is, and ignore all the other stuff, because at the end of the day, my personal enjoyment is much more important, and his success is much more important than your suffering. And that's the problem that happens if we talk about stuff like Neil Gaiman in the future without at least mentioning what has happened. Now, I personally would just not give him any free press. But if for whatever reason, as a content creator, we would say, well, Neil Gaiman is such a big name that it's important to mention what he's doing right now. If he's putting out a new book or whatever, we need to talk about this because, he's such an integral part of the fantasy genre. Then we need to make sure that people, are constantly reminded what went on, what he has been accused of, and this stuff does not get pushed into the back, because this is how living people, when they are accused of anything of this sort or anything else, how they act with this is like silencing criticism, saying nothing, hoping it will blow over, and then coming back and just hoping that people have forgotten or are not willing to constantly remind them about it. And I think as creators, when we're putting out new work, when we're putting out any work about these artists, these accused people, it is our duty to remind them. It is our duty to hold them, tell the world what has happened so people can be aware of that. Because, yeah, that's integral here. Because on the one hand, it does, show people that have gone through similar experiences that we care, that we trust them, we believe them, we see them. We don't just support their abusers for our own entertainment or even monetary gain. And it gives other people the opportunity to form an opinion on what kind of art they are consuming. We live in a world of social media. It is basically impossible to not find out about these things sooner or later. And if we tell people up front, we save people from the experience of finding a new favorite book and then finding out afterwards that it was written by a racist, homophobe, sexual abuser, any of these things, and then having to come to these really painful realizations within ourselves, like how do we deal with the fact that my favorite book was written by a massive dickhead? We're doing only good if we are upfront about these things, if we mention it in our coverage of these artists. If we go back in our older content, link stuff. If we go forward, we link stuff. If we decide that it is essential to talk about these things. Because at the end of the day, if there are no legal consequences whatsoever, the best we can do is still signal to victims, signal to survivors, signal to people in similar situations that we are on their side, that we support them, and that we will always support them. So that's all I have to say on the Neil Gaiman situation. As I said, I'll link a couple of videos down there that I think give a good overview of the accusations, of the situations, of the medium they were, brought forward through. All of that stuff is its own gigantic mess. I have a lot of views, ideas and thoughts on that, but I am incredibly unqualified to talk about it in any public forum. So I'll just link people that I think have done a good job of doing so. And then you can do with this whatever the fuck you want. Yeah, that was a mess. Anyway, let me know what you think about it. Let me know how you deal with these kind of things. If you are a creator, how you deal with these things when you are just a consumer of art, how you think creators should deal with this in the future. Let's talk about it in the comments, all right? Anyway, thanks for watching. Do the things that you feel necessary. I don't want to, ask for support or anything at this point. Just, thanks for watching. I'll see you very soon with something that is way more fun. Sort of. Cheers.